These are the topics that we did: work, religion, politics, pain, family, addiction, mental health, and Norman. So those were the different contexts that we looked at how the gospel works in and through. Obviously not an exhaustive list, but tried to make a broad list to where we could have a good understanding to how to apply some of these principles. So I have a couple of questions for us to go through today. The first one is solid. It's going to be one of those weeks. Happy Mother's Day. Okay, well, how do you / what can you say to a person who does not realize they have an addiction? Obviously, this was given in the context of our Gospel and Addiction series. So how do you / what can you say to a person who doesn't realize they have an addiction? So what we want to do with all of these questions we're talking about today is to approach them with a gospel mindset. So you ask yourself the why questions is always a good place to start. So why would I want to do anything at all about if I thought someone was addicted? What's my motivation to action at all? Why not just let them sit and that's their problem? It's not my problem, it's their problem. Well, ultimately, while it might be, their actions affect me and people I love and all that stuff, which is true, if you keep going down through the layers, it's going to come down to the reality that you need to do something and you want to do something because that addiction is destroying a person that matters and has value in the eyes of God. And so that is why we are anti-addiction, is because we are anti the image of God being destroyed. Hey, come on in, Berlin. Feel free to pull up a chair. We're doing it family style today. So that's kind of the mindset that we need to have of the why should we do anything at all? Because they're made in the image of God and Jesus died to save them. The gospel says they are valuable and worthy of love in the eyes of God and therefore in the eyes of his people, us. So that means that your motivation for any involvement with a person's addiction or anything like that comes down to a word that's already come up a few times today, which is just cool of the sovereignty of God. It's the word compassion. So being able to have compassion for another person. Obviously, one of our core values is to put compassion in action. This is a great kind of thought exercise to go through of how you can do that. This is utterly pointless to put anything up here. I'll read you all of these verses. So there, I just pulled a sample of 5 instances in the New Testament, 5 instances in the Gospels where Jesus has compassion for the people that he's around. So the first one's Matthew 14:14. It says, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd and he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Matthew 15:32a. Then Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion on the crowd because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. Matthew 20:34 says, and Jesus, in pity or compassion, touched their eyes and immediately they recovered their sight and followed him. Mark 1:41 says, moved with pity or compassion, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. Luke 7:13, and when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, do not weep. So woven all in and throughout this story of Jesus' life is this theme of compassion for the people around him. And it wasn't just compassion for the people of God, but extended to those who were the least of these in society, to the lepers, to the sinners, to the unclean, to the insert whatever you want there. The most hated people in the time, the most loved people in the time, from the centurion to the prostitute. Jesus is having compassion on these people. And it's his expectation that we would also have compassion on these people. So that's important for that to be your heart posture in starting out with any sort of conversation that might lead to a need for correction or something like that. If you can't have the conversation from the place of compassion, you're not ready to have the conversation yet. There's a church planter he's in like the Tulsa area who I went through training with. He has this great little line that he loves to say. I'm sure I've quoted it a handful of times, but it's says about his church, we exist to love people to life, not judge them to death. And I think that that's a really cool picture of what the job of the church is, because we know that judgment is for the Lord, meaning condemning someone to a life in hell or to, those sorts of things. That's not our place. It is our place to practice discernment and to speak truth and to be the voice of the prophet, speaking mouthpiece of God when we're called to do those things. Absolutely. I'm not lessening that. But it also says they will know you by your love for one another. So love is one of our motivating factors here, a key part of compassion. We want to love them to life rather than just going in guns blazing, trying to just fix all of these problems. Everyone's a problem, fix them. That's not the heart posture you want to have. If you're going to go in like Bob the Builder, then you're going to end up with a short run on Nickelodeon and then, a bunch of backpacks and merchandise on the shelves. But if you go in like Jesus, you can stand the test of time. So let Jesus be the judge, let Jesus be the healer, and you can save those jobs for him. It doesn't have to be your job to be judge and to be healer in that situation. That's how God works. So the very first action of compassion that you can do is obviously prayer. All of these sort of conversations should be bathed in prayer first and foremost for yourself, again, to be in the right heart set, but also to be asking for wisdom and guidance and favor in the conversation and all of those things, kind of tilling the soil before you go in for that moment. And then praying for the person who you're going to be talking to as well, that their hearts would be prepared and that they would be ready to receive whatever truth God has for them in that. In general, when you go in to have these conversations, you can look a lot at the life of Jesus. He uses a lot of questions when he's in highly charged situations. Whenever someone is trying to entrap him, and one of the first things you see Jesus do is respond with these questions. And it's not just like a good debate tactic. It's a really good skill to have as a counselor and as a follower of Christ, because ultimately, what we don't have is what Jesus had, which was perfect access to the Father and to the Holy Spirit and all those things. And ours is being mediated through our flesh right now, which is imperfect and sinful, which means we don't have all of the information when we're going into these conversations. The more questions that you can ask and try to get down to the why that this person struggles with an addiction, the better. If you think back to even the conversations that we had during the gospel and addiction lesson that we did, someone brought up, I think it was Donna, but I can't remember, that it's sometimes these addictions are tied to some sort of experience in their past or something that they're avoiding, whatever the addiction is the medication for, in that sense of what they're trying to get away from. And the more that you can get to know a person and what's at the root of that hurt, the better armed you will be with what truth to speak into them, because we know the gospel is rooted in hope, and that it produces perfect hope, perfect fulfillment and satisfaction in a way that these other things don't. But if you go in and say, hey, don't worry, one day you're going to be reborn, but the person's hurt is, honestly, I would just rather have never been born. I've never been valued, I don't want to be born. You're speaking the wrong hope to their hurt. But if you can give them you can find where they are the most incomplete, you can show them, hey, this is how the gospel makes you complete, and you can tailor it to them as well and present that beautiful truth to them. While the actual way that you would approach whatever this conversation is going to be different, because it should be tailored case by case, the destination, I think, is the same. You should be trying to lead that person closer to Jesus, whether they're a believer or not. You should be leading them to Jesus, because again, he's the one who has the perfect healing and the perfect understanding of their heart and the perfect hope in his hands. So you start from the same position of compassion, and you're heading to the same destination of bringing them closer to Christ. But I know that it's more helpful to have specifics in what to do, because it feels like such a intimidating task to just say, okay, go and confront this person about what you think is an addiction in their life that's hurting them, that you don't think they have any perception of. I think starting with some version of, hey, I care about you and I'm worried about you is a good place to start, because that, as soon as you start the conversation, shows them your heart and Jesus' heart for compassion for them, shows them their value, shows them that you have seen worth in them, that you would be, I'm worried about you, not, hey, your behavior is X. I think leading from that, it demonstrates the heart of Christ in the way you say those things. Then after you've said, I'm worried about you, you can identify maybe the patterns of behavior you've seen in their lives and how it's harmful to themselves and others, whatever that particular context is that you need to highlight. But that's where you kind of have diverging paths in the conversation. Is this person a Christian? Is this person not a Christian? I think that's an important thing to understand, because they're going to, a Christian has already claimed a certain sense of belonging to Christ, right? That I am part of this family of faith, this standard of living that was set by Christ, and I've said these things are already innately valuable to me. So that gives you a common ground to start the conversation on as well. You say something like, I know that you love God, but right now it looks like blank is pulling you away from him. And I know that you don't want that because you have told me that you're a Christian. Whatever you're looking for in that thing, I know you can find that in Jesus. Let's go to him. And you can facilitate a conversation that way and highlight it for them in that sense. The word addiction didn't even come up in that example. And I think that's okay. Depending on where they're at, it might be easier and better received to just have the conversation in terms of, hey, this is drawing you away from Jesus. Let's pull you back to Jesus. Because if that's something they know they want, the word addiction comes up, it could very easily create a defensive posture. So it just kind of keeps the conversational safety in place there too, to kind of approach it from that perspective. To a non-Christian, I'd probably say something more along the lines of, I know you said that blank meets your needs for whatever. This is in the context of having had these conversations and kind of getting to the bottom of these things. But that's a real need that you have, but trying to meet it with blank is already starting to hurt you, and I care too much about you to just sit back and watch that happen. Can I tell you about how God meets that need for me? And gives you an opportunity to step right into the gospel and to share those sorts of things. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's don't print out this script and go take it with you to your next confrontation. But I'm hoping some of those principles might be helpful in how to navigate a conversation like that. And just remembering the start place and the end goal is the same in those conversations. And just as an encouragement, remember that the Holy Spirit goes before you and beside you and behind you in these conversations. So even if you go in and you've done all of the work of, I want to be compassionate, all those things, and you get into the conversation and it totally blows up and goes sideways on you and you're like, wow, I really botched that. Then you can know, hey, the Holy Spirit is going to go behind me into there and is going to be able to turn whatever mess I just created into something beautiful, because it's what he does, and it's what he did for me, and it's what he can do for them. So you continue praying and all of those things as well. So there is no amount of damage that you can do that God cannot undo, overcome, or still utilize for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his glory in the gospel. So let's move on to our next question then. This one's a personal favorite of mine, because all right, well, you can see enough of that to read it. Why doesn't God usually heal? It's obvious he can. This came out of our Gospel in Pain series. This is such a good question, but I think we need to clarify what is being asked here. Because I think the heart of this question is, why doesn't God usually heal people supernaturally or miraculously? Because God does usually heal people. If you look at, through surgeons and immune systems and penicillin and physical therapy, like modern medicine and the body's natural healing capacities don't circumvent the work of God. They are only possible through the power of God. So God is absolutely in the healing business all the time.
Business is booming.
And business is booming. So we can absolutely just say yes and amen to that, and this question still lingers. because this is a question about why doesn't God supernaturally intervene in healing, even though we know that he can. We've read about it in his word, all of those things, which is, supernaturally outside of the natural, so outside of our bodies and outside of what we would consider medical means. In talking with missionaries, so for those of you guys who don't know, actually, my parents were part of a missionary training organization. So I've gotten to meet and know quite a few international missionaries firsthand, and gotten to hear a lot of their stories of being in other countries, and the rate of miraculous healing is significantly higher and more extreme in the types of healings that they've seen as well. I mean, I've heard stories from people who I really truly trust say things like they've watched hands regrow that have been cut off. They've watched diseases be cured, snake bites disappear, like these really big, tangible healing moments. And they report them at a much higher rate in less developed countries with less access to medicine and to doctors and that sort of thing. While they might not use the word usually to talk about these healings, they would definitely use the word more common to describe what they see there. But that doesn't mean that God isn't healing people in places where he also has medicine. In fact, I brought a prop. This is a 2-volume set by a very well-known and thought of philosopher and sociologist Craig Keener on miracles. The bulk of this 2-volume set is of well-documented and verified accounts of miracles, both in the ancient world and the modern world, both in third world countries and in highly developed nations like the United States and the UK. Like this is a massive amount, and it's not entirely full of that, but several hundred pages are testimonies of that. I'll read you just a quick excerpt of it, just to get a feel for what some of these stories are like. An American Baptist pastor in Michigan, who has long been an adjunct professor in Palmer Seminary's D-Min program, Dr. John Pipo, shared with me several reports from his church, including one of an instant and complete healing of a visitor to his church. Before the healing, the person was a non-Christian. He further referred me to another person from his church who claimed to have been healed, Carl Cockrell. In March 2006, after a spiritual retreat in Branson, Missouri, Carl was checking the oil in his car when he stepped down and felt a sharp crack. Although he was a Vietnam veteran, he says that he had never felt such pain and he fainted. X-rays at the emergency room in the Branson hospital revealed such a serious break of the ankle that after setting the break, the orthopedist ordered him to stay overnight. During that night, though, Carl recounts that he experienced a voice from the Lord assuring him that his foot was not broken. After putting Carl's foot in a cast and warning that he would need months of therapy, the doctor referred him and to his family physician. Carl's wife drove them back to Michigan, and the next day his family doctor sent him to the hospital for some more x-rays. After receiving the x-rays, his doctor called him into the office and explained that there were no breaks or even tissue indicating where the break had been. "You never had a broken ankle," the doctor explained. Carl pointed out the x-rays from Missouri. "That is a broken ankle," the doctor admitted. But now there was no sign that he had ever had one, so the doctor removed the cast right away. Apart from the ankle being blue for a couple of days, Carl had no problem with it. At church that Sunday, where he used no crutches or other support, he testified how God healed him. Carl provided me with the radiology reports from before and after the healing supported his claim. And it just goes on and on and on through different accounts of equally verified healings and miracles. So it's not that God doesn't do these healings. And while God may not, usually choose to heal people in this way, he still does, and it's even more often than we realize. It doesn't always get the press, doesn't always get, you're not going to see it on CNN or Fox or whatever news outlet you look on. But that's not really the heart of this question either. Because when you're asking this question, it's very rarely a hypothetical question. You are actually asking, why hasn't God healed this person whom I love and I pray for every day? For me, this struggle is very tangible. You guys know Alyssa. You know that she is legally blind. And I know myself and dozens of other people who have prayed for her fervently since she was a 6th grader for her eyes to be healed. And to this point, the answer has been no. And to me, that feels incredibly unfair. Because I see all these bozos out there robbing banks and doing God knows what else with 20/20 vision. I'm like, hey, that doesn't seem quite right. My wife's awesome. How come she doesn't get to have vision? But they all do, and they get to use it for evil. What? Right. What does that do to your heart? When you pray this, when you are fully committed to the truth that God can heal, it's a power within His ability, it's a knowledge within His intellect, and we know it's within His nature to give good gifts to His children. What it does to my heart on my bad days is discourage my heart. To say, well, God, it really feels like you don't care, because I'm having a hard time coming up with another reason why you wouldn't heal. Why you wouldn't heal this person in this way when I ask. How could I worship a God like that who comes across as cruel and unloving of His people? Well, what I'm really saying when I say that is I know what's good and loving better than God knows. So I'm saying, hey, God, guess what? I figured out what's the best thing you could do here. How about you go ahead and get to doing that? What's more likely? That I understand goodness and mercy and love and miracles better than the God who does all of those things, or that maybe I'm missing some pieces of the puzzle. And maybe I can't see the full zoomed out picture here. One of my favorite pastor authors of all time, Tim Keller, has this amazing quote about prayer. He says, rather than just give us what we ask for, God gives us what we would have asked for if we knew everything that He knew. It's just like, have you guys ever heard, I think this is actually a C.S. Lewis story, but it's the little boy who's playing in the mud, making mud pies, and his adult comes along and says, hey son, guess what? I just got us tickets to Disneyland. You want to go to Disneyland with me? And the little boy said, I'm good. I just want to play with my mud pies here. He's like, oh, you don't understand. We can go to Disneyland. It's going to be so fun. The little boy says, I don't know, can I make mud pies there? That would be pretty fun. He is because he doesn't know what Disneyland is. He doesn't have a perception of what could happen out there and all of the fullness of that picture. He's so focused on this little thing in front of him that this is all that he wants. But if he knew what was in Disneyland, he couldn't get away from that mud pie fast enough. Just like for us, the thing that we are praying for and begging God to do, even though it's a good thing, if we knew the full scope of what God knew, we would be praying differently. I don't know what we would be praying for, but we'd be praying differently. Because what God sees is greater, is better, and more perfect than what we see. So if He's giving you a no on what is a good thing that you're praying for, there's an even better reason for His no. And that's a very humbling thing for me to hear. And it really kind of puts me back in the right relationship with God in that moment to say, all right, God, I don't like what you're doing. I don't understand what you're doing, but I know enough of who you are to trust you in what you're doing. Maybe He knows that the testimony of this sufferer will save the soul of the nurse who cares for them in the hospital. Maybe he knows that the sufferer will discover the beauty of total reliance on God through this journey of pain and loss and suffering and grief, and they wouldn't trade that closeness with God for any amount of physical health and wholeness, because the closeness with God was more important and valuable to them than the wholeness of their body. Maybe this person's suffering will enable them to walk alongside someone else who's going through suffering and be able to minister to them on a level that only someone who's been in the fire could do. Maybe he knows that in the right moment, he will heal this person and bring himself glory. But the moment's just not right yet. The bottom line is that he knows what we do not, but we know him and we know his grace, and he tells us that that's enough. In 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10, we referenced this verse when we talked about the gospel and pain. But Paul says this, "So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelation, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" This is the ultimate portrait of why God might allow pain and suffering. Because we don't need anything other than the grace of Jesus to be made whole. No amount of physical brokenness, mental, emotional brokenness, whatever that healing that you're praying for is, no amount of that, if you fixed it tomorrow, is going to satisfy you the way that the perfect grace of Jesus Christ satisfies you. And so when he says, "No, I'm not going to heal you. No, I'm not going to heal that person," we get to be very grateful that he said, "But yes, I will die for that person. Yes, I will be broken for that person." It's not a happy place to live in, but it's a very healthy place to live in, knowing that our God is enough and is worth worshiping even when he doesn't heal when we know he can. There's this great moment in the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story. It's just, seared into my brain of when Nebuchadnezzar gives Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego one more chance to worship him before he's going to throw them into this fiery furnace. And they respond to him. They said, "We will not. We believe that our God will save us from that furnace. But even if he doesn't, we will not worship you." And I think that is a very good image of the balance of complete and total faith in your God's ability to do the miraculous. I don't know that they had any conception of how he was going to save them, but he said, "We believe that he will save us. And even if he doesn't, we will not worship you." I think you could superimpose that onto this healing conversation. I 100% believe that God will heal blank, but even if he doesn't, I will not stop worshiping him. Amen. And that's the balance, because we do see, it is a very easy conversation to get caught up in when you're looking at the New Testament and healing in the New Testament. And you say, it's always tied to the amount of faith of the individual. And you can say that. There is some very tremendous expressions of faith and of desperation that leads to faith and to all these different stories. And clearly God uses these healings to highlight the faith of these people. But our God is not a vending machine either. It's not that you have to have a certain amount of faith to pay for said miracle. That's not the way that our God operates. You can see it here in the Apostle Paul. I don't think it's a very good practice to question the faithfulness of Paul. I think he had a pretty big measure of faith, and yet God explicitly told him, I will not take this away from you. Whether it was a physical ailment or not, the principle stands. So my question comes out of what Andy taught, I guess last week. Been a long week, but he taught on the gospel in Norman. And so my question was, how do we as Magnify live out the gospel in our community to keep it all the way contextualized down? So I have been really chewing on this since Andy taught last week, especially since he highlighted the difference between how believers gather and how unbelievers gather. He's talking about where they gather, how they gather, all of the things. And I couldn't get enough of it. And just to tell on myself, my mind immediately starts thinking like, okay, so we need to start like some sort of like intentional like ministry program where we go take the gospel into coffee shops and gyms and all this stuff. And we're going to, just kind of disseminate ourselves throughout Norman. And we're going to make this whole big program on the pickleball courts, to win people to Jesus in Norman. I think that being my first response really shows a flaw in my heart. Because, at least in my view of church, because my first instinct was, we need to start a program to reach the city. And right after that, Andy asked the question, what non-believer would call you friend? And I was like, ooh, mine's an embarrassingly short list. Embarrassingly short. And I can give myself all the slack in the world of I've only lived in Norman for 10 months. And it doesn't matter because it was the same score in Shawnee. And I lived there for 8 years. This is a fundamental shift in the way that I think about, and I think that we as a church should think about, what is the role of Magnify in reaching the city of Norman. It's not the macro level of programs and strategies and all of these things. It's the micro level. It's not programs, it's people. What non-believer would call you friend? Well, that's where you start. You go to them and you love them. There's this, I might have referenced it before, but there's this old story about a university president who they would build these new buildings on campus, and then all of the civil engineer types would get all bent out of shape because they'd come back and talk to the president. They say, all of these darn college students keep walking straight through all the courtyards and the grass, and they're making all these footpaths everywhere. When we spent the time paving all these sidewalks, and nobody uses the sidewalks, they're walking all over the place, cutting through the grass. And so finally, after 3 or 4 buildings worth of doing this, the president said, okay, well this time, let's build a building with no sidewalks. Let's wait, give about 2 months, and let's come back and talk. They build the building, they come back 2 months later, they said, okay, it's time to build some sidewalks. Where should we put them? He said, put the sidewalks where the footpaths are. Where people are already walking is where you put the effort of paving the roads. That's what I think is supposed to be Magnify's approach as an organization to reaching the city, is not to start programs and tell our people, okay, go pound pavement on the sidewalks that we just paved. But it's, no, you guys go out and where are your footpaths? Who do you see during the week? Who do you already have relationship with? Where are you already engaging our city with the gospel? Or where do you have the opportunity to be engaging our city with the gospel? What non-believers call you friend? And you start sharing there. Maybe we'll get the opportunity to where God uses one of your footpaths to open a door for Magnify to create a sidewalk. I feel like in a lot of ways our Adopt a Unit thing with DHS kind of has that element to it. Donna has been creating a footpath with DHS for several years now through Open Heart Resource Room. Building these relationships, getting the contacts, all that stuff, so that when we came and started this church and we said, okay, I think we want to minister to social workers, oh my gosh, it was so much easier than it ever should have been to get a foot in that door and to be given the keys to the car at DHS. They came, I don't know if you guys noticed, they came to us and asked us if we would be the pilot group for this Adopt a Unit program. I didn't have to go pound on any doors or anything. That's God just throwing stuff open because of the faithfulness of Donna and of Jerry, and to a certain extent of Alyssa, and I guess you could say myself, of just being a part of CAM and doing this DHS thing. Like, that's the direction that I hope that our church is able to go in the future, is to say, as the footpaths bear fruit and God points us towards the footpaths is when we start to have conversations about sidewalks. Because I don't know if you know this, we're a little strapped on resources at this church. No matter how you measure resources, we are limited in those things, which means we have to rely on God all the more to be doing the work. It's a great opportunity. What we can look at as a limitation, we can instead look at as the thorn in our flesh, like Paul said. It's our opportunity to stay humble and to look at God. I know that it's tempting to look at the fact that we have an empty table over here and that our whole church that's in attendance this week fits around 2 6-foot tables, and to say, man, I'm a little discouraged 9 months into planting a church that the church still looks like this. If you think I haven't had that thought, I am so grateful that you think so highly of me in my faith and trust in the Lord. I think that more often than I care to admit. This is our opportunity to trust in God and to say, even if He doesn't bring more people to Magnify, even if we do close our doors in 2 to 3 years when the money runs out, I'm still going to worship Him. I'm still going to give Him all the praise. And I know that this time was not wasted. Now, I'm not ready to settle for the church closing in 2 to 3 years while we sit on our hands. I'm ready to go out and work for Jesus. I'm ready to go out and share about what He's done in my life with every non-believer that I know through a loving relationship, by developing real compassion for the people that God's placed in my life. That's how I want to live. That's how I want to call you guys to live. I want to be very explicit and clear in this. If you're out there sharing the gospel with people, building relationship with non-believers, leading people to Christ and all of that, and they never darken the doors of this church, that's a win. That's what we're about. We're about kingdom growth. How often do we have to say it's about the kingdom, not the castle? I'm not saying let's go out for Jesus so that Magnify can have 3 tables. Like, that's not what I'm saying. But this is what it looks like for a church of, really 15 people or so, 15 to 20 on a good week, to reach a city of an awful lot more than that. That is 80% lost, 80,000 people in our city who don't know Christ. That's how we reach them, is one at a time, where God is already creating footpaths. You go walk on the footpaths and you share with people. At the restaurants you frequent, in the neighborhoods that you live in the communities that you're a part of, at the jobs that you work, whatever that context looks like, there's people in your life who are ready to hear about Jesus from you.